Okay, good morning. Thank you for being here. So today we are going to be walking through the 26-27 qualified allocation plan for the 9% LIHTC program and how applications will be evaluated this cycle. The goal is to really understand scoring, the regional distribution, timing of applications, and application sequencing, and how they kind of interact with one another so that the planning for you guys is clear for this upcoming round. I also want to mention that this is also acting as the technical assistance session. So we are recording this session as of right now, and this will be posted to our website after the session. If you haven't done so already, please download the conference app. To find it, you can search for Eventry Events app in your phone's app store. You can use the login using code 215226 to access the 2025 Ohio Housing Conference app. The username will be your email used during OHC registration, and the password is your first name. This is case sensitive and matches how you entered your name at the registration. It's also on the back of your badge. Also, don't forget to complete this session survey when you're done here today. And again, this year we're offering continuing education credits for the conference sessions. This session is eligible, so please make sure you get your badge scanned when you arrived, and you'll also need to scan your badge again at the end of the session. And so with that, I'll go ahead and begin. So I'm Cody Price. I'm the 9% Housing Tax Credit Section Chief at the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. Feel free to follow up. I have my email here listed on the slide if you want to reach out to talk about any of your project questions that you may have. We also have the overall 9% program email address, which is qap@ohiohome.org. So again, if you have any questions about the QAP, any questions regarding your project or anything, feel free to reach out to one of these two email addresses and we can set up a meeting to discuss. So we're going to start out with the broader context, kind of looking at the big picture of things, the state of the credit, and funding capacity. So let's start with a quick refresher on how the 9% credits ceiling is determined each year. So the amount of the 9% LIHTC credits available to Ohio isn't something OFA sets. It comes directly from the IRS, and it's driven from a very simple formula as shown on the screen. So each year we take the IRS population estimate for Ohio and multiply it by the IRS per capita multiplier for that year. The result of this formula is the Ohio's 9% annual LIHTC ceiling. So for example, if Ohio's population increases or if Congress adjusts the per capita multiplier, the total amount of 9% credits also increases. Whereas if the population trends downward, the ceiling can actually drop as well. So the table at the bottom of the screen shows how that formula has played out in recent years. So back in 2021, the credit ceiling was about $32.9 million, and we received credits for 39 projects. In 2022 and 2023, the ceiling held fairly steady, around 30 to 32 million in annual credits, which supported about 31 projects per year. And then in 2024 and 2025, we see a gradual increase again, up to 35.6 million in 2025, and we made 23 allocations earlier this year. We're also projecting, well, I'll get there slightly. So the reduction in the number of awards throughout these past 5 years really reflects higher per project credit requests, which have been driven by rising construction costs, interest rates, and operating expenses. And then lastly, I just want to point out that President Trump's Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed on July 4th of this year, expanded the 9% LIHTC program, which is really increasing our 9% allocation by 12% each year. Thus, I'm kind of estimating that our 9% credit ceiling for 2026 will be roughly 40.9 million in annual 9% credits. And so this is the highest we've seen in several years. However, it is important to keep in mind that we have been seeing equity pricing decrease. It's predicted to continually decrease, so it may not necessarily mean we are able to fund more deals, as projects may need more credits in the future. So let's talk about the cost environment that we've all been navigating over the past decade. So this chart is showing the multifamily residential construction cost index going back to 2016. What you'll notice here is that costs were relatively stable and predictable up until about 2019. We saw slow, steady growth, but nothing really dramatic. Then in 2021, we start to see the sharp upward trend. This coincides with what we all experienced firsthand. We saw supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, wage competition, and volatility in materials like lumber, steel, and concrete. So costs didn't just increase, they really jumped during this time period. So by early 2022, we were up nearly 40% compared to pre-pandemic levels. And while the pace of increase has moderated since then, costs have not gone back down. Instead, they've remained relatively elevated and continue to inch upward. So even though we are seeing that the market is stabilizing, we're operating in this new normal where the baseline development costs are significantly higher than they were just a few years ago. And this has a direct implication to the 9% program. So as I said, projects are requiring more credits to kind of pencil out, but we do have this fixed statewide credit ceiling. This means that the number of awards we can make has decreased, even though the need for housing continues to grow in Ohio. And so this cost environment is a major driver behind some of the policy and program adjustments we've made in the 26 and 27 QAP, such as tying our costs containment to this index. We're also tying our max credit request to this index, as well as the scoring criteria, the annual LIHTC request per LIHTC unit is being tied to this to really ensure that our numbers within the QAP are realistic for LIHTC development. This slide's bringing together the two trends we just looked at, so the annual change in Ohio's 9% credit ceiling and the year-over-year change in multifamily construction costs. So the blue line is showing how much the statewide credit ceiling changes each year, and the green line is showing the change in construction costs. So what we see here is that these two lines do not move together. The credit ceiling has grown slowly and steadily, generally in the range of 0 to maybe 5% per year, because it's tied primarily to population and the federal per capita adjustments. Meanwhile, construction costs are far more volatile. In 21 and 22, for example, again, the construction costs increased by double-digit percentages year over year, while the credit ceiling declined or grew only marginally. So this really created a significant gap. And that gap is kind of the core pressure point we've been managing in the 9% program. So costs were rising quickly, credit availability was growing slowly, and the difference between the two meant that each project needed more credits to be feasible. And so that's why during that time period, we did institute an additional credits policy to kind of provide projects additional 9% credits to cover these increase in costs. So this slide is showing how many 9% applications we've received each year compared to how many awards we're able to make. So the green area is representing the total proposals submitted each year, and the blue area is representing the projects that ultimately received a 9% reservation. So back in 2015 and 2016, we were seeing just over 100 proposals each year with around 40 awards. That meant roughly a 2-to-1 competitiveness ratio, so still very competitive but manageable for applicants. As we move forward through the decade, there's a noticeable decline in total proposals. So by 2022, we were down to about 76 proposals. And then in 2024 and 2025, that number dropped further into the mid-60s. Now the number of reservations has also declined during that same time period. So again, from the 40 project range in earlier years to the lower 20s today. The reason really is not lack of demand, it's really cost pressure, right? So as project costs have increased, each individual project needs a larger share of the limited statewide credit. And so because this credit ceiling is really growing slowly and predictably, the only lever that moves in response to this is kind of the number of awards. So what we're seeing here is not really a drop or interest in the 9% program. In fact, we kind of know that housing demand is stronger than ever, but we're seeing that rising costs have really changed the scale of what a typical 9% project requires, and this has really reshaped how many awards we can feasibly make in a given year. And so this slide is really bringing together these two trends we've just been discussing. So the total amount of 9% credits available to Ohio each year, as well as the number of 9% awards we've actually been able to make. So again, the green area is showing the annual 9% credit ceiling. The blue line is showing the number of projects that received a 9% reservation. And so what's striking here is really that these two lines are moving in opposite directions. So from 2015 through 2025, the credit ceiling has generally increased from the upper $20 million range to the mid $30 million range, and now projected to exceed $40 million in 2026. So in terms of available credits, the state's capacity has actually grown. But again, over the same time period, the number of 9% reservations has steadily declined from around 40 awards per year in the mid-2010s to the low to mid-20s in recent years. And so this slide is really indicating, looking at how the size of 9% projects has changed over time and how that relates to this maximum LIHTC award. So the green line is showing the maximum 9% award allowed under the QAP each year. And the blue line is showing the average number of units in an awarded 9% project. So since 2015, we've seen a sharp decline in the average number of units per project, peaking in 2015 at 65 units to a low of 47 units in 2023. Again, this is mostly due to that rising construction cost per unit and equity and market constraints that we talked about earlier. We also see that the max LIHTC award in blue had not tracked with inflation and other rising costs, and that maintained either at $1 million per project or to $1.25 million per project. Therefore, to really increase the average project size, we increased the max LIHTC reservation amount in 2024 to $1.75 million per project. As a result, we did see an increase in the average project size of 14 units, so from 47 units per project to 61 units per project. Thus, in last year's 2025 technical amendment, we wrote into the QAP that this max annual LIHTC request will be adjusted to the multifamily residential construction cost index that was highlighted earlier to really ensure that this amount keeps pace with the market and that 9% LIHTC projects remain in the 60s. So as a result, the max LIHTC request for the 2025 round rose to $1,781,500 for new affordability, and we saw that this average project size resulted in 62 units per project. And then so for 2026, we adjusted again to inflation, so that increased to $1.8 million per project for 2026. So I, again, predict that we'll continue to see an average project size in the mid-60s for 2026. So given the cost environment and the pressure on the 9% ceiling that we guys walked through, the focus of the 2026-2027 QAP is really about feasibility, looking at readiness, and making sure awarded projects can move forward on schedule. So there are several key updates to highlight. First is really looking at experience and capacity reviews. And I'll be mentioning this kind of several times throughout the presentation. But what I'll just say here is just that the experience and capacity reviews are occurring before the proposal applications are due in February. So in previous QAP cycles, we had a pre-application process, and that review was tied to each individual project. So you submitted a pre-app for every deal you were considering to submit in the 9% round, and we would review the experience in the context of that specific proposal. However, in the 2026-2027 QAP, this is changing. So experience and capacity is no longer project specific, but it is now entity specific. So instead of submitting a separate pre-app for each development, each participating entity completes one experience and capacity certification ahead of the funding round. And then you must submit your proposal application with each entity listed in that development structure having a approved experience and capacity certification approval letter. So this is really doing two things. It's hoping to reduce duplication so you don't have to resubmit the same organizational documents for multiple projects. It's also ensuring that capacity issues are kind of addressed early. So before teams are starting to build site control strategies or assembling financial commitments or preparing for scoring materials. So this shift is really about sequencing and certainty. So get your entity approved first and then build your project. Second is looking at CHOTO certifications, and that is now aligned to this same experience and capacity review process. So I'll be getting at timing of things later in the presentation. But the purpose of this is intended to reduce duplicate effort and kind of avoid late cycle certification delays that may have caused challenges in previous rounds. Third, previously scored items are now moved mostly to threshold items in this QAP. So several items in the past that were used to award competitive points are now threshold requirements. This was really done to kind of simplify the scoring requirements as almost all developments included such items. Thus, we kind of felt that these were no longer really considered scoring differentiators, but rather threshold items for these projects. Fourth, we kind of increased the max LIHTC request as well as cost containment and the annual LIHTC request per unit. And these have all been adjusted upwards in response to the multifamily residential construction cost index. Fifth, we've explicitly wrote into the QAP that the forward allocation is expected to be reduced. So this was an intentional step to really preserve our 9% credit ceiling. So we're currently roughly 50% forward allocated. What this means is that of the 23 reservations that we made earlier this year, about half of those are receiving 2025 credits, whereas the other half will be receiving 2026 credits. So we're actually pulling from our future credit ceiling to fund current awards. We want to reduce this forward allocation so that we can shore up our pipeline in the future. Sixth, we've also included an award sequence within our QAP, particularly around this region first approach, which I'll be diving into more shortly. This is really about transparency and predictability with the goal that applicants should have a clear understanding of how projects are going to be prioritized within and across the 5 regions of Ohio. And then lastly, really pointing out this Appendix A, which is kind of looking at our submission timing and the checklists that have been updated. So this is probably the most practical improvement of the QAP. It's kind of providing clear expectations up front. We reduce a lot of reworks and supports a smoother, more efficient intake and review process. So for the 26-27 QAP, some items that were previously required at proposal have shifted to being due at final application, and a few items have actually moved the other direction. So the goal is kind of to put this information in the right place across the process and not kind of reduce a lot of work for you guys up front, but ensuring that you are submitting complete and accurate applications. So because of these shifts, just wanted pointing out that this is very important for you guys to check out Appendix A to just look to see what is kind of due at the experience capacity, what's due at proposal, what's due at final, and what would be due at 8609 requests, which again, I will be highlighting some of these further later in the presentation. So before we talk about scoring or competitive positioning, I want to kind of ground everyone in really the foundation of the QAP. This is really looking at the threshold and eligibility requirements that are kind of outlined in the QAP. These are baseline items that determine whether an application can move smoothly into scoring and underwriting. So getting these pieces right up front will help avoid deficiencies, follow-up requests, and potentially delays later in the process. So as part of this QAP cycle, there are several policy documents that are either new or updated, and these work together to kind of support the application process. So first is really looking at this 2026 experiencing capacity standards. These are new. These establish the expectations for organizational readiness and are now completed before proposal application. So this is the foundation step we kind of discussed earlier. And I will be highlighting this more towards the end of the presentation. But please note that those that have been approved in 2025 on the 4% side that are at levels M4 to M6 are automatically approved for the 2026 round. So all you'll need to do is submit your approval letter that you received with last year or this year really in 2025 on the 4% side. We also have all entity approvals are included on our website on the 4% page currently. So if you want to check your status, please go to our 4% LIHTC page on our website and you can check to see what approval letter level you are currently at. Next is looking at the 2026 CHOTO guidelines and applications. These have been updated. So the goal here is really, again, to align CHOTO certification timing with the experience and capacity review so that the process is more consistent and sequence. The application and guideline of these remain relatively unchanged from last year. Really only the dates and the submission guidelines have changed, which is really directing applicants to submit this application to our FTS or a file transfer site. You all should be familiar with that. If not, I have a slide later on that's going on some guidance for there. We also have our 2026 multifamily rental underwriting guidelines. These are currently out in draft format. So if you have not already, please take a look at these guidelines. There are slight updates from our previous 2023 LIHTC rental underwriting guidelines. The current guidelines are out for public comment. Comments are due by Monday, November 17th. So there's still time to comment on these first draft guidelines. Our goal is to take these to board for approval in December, which means that they will be effective starting January 1 of 2026. So these will be what you guys follow for the 2026 round. We also have our HDL guidelines. These remain relatively unchanged from the 2023 guidelines that are posted on our website. So those seeking an equity bridge loan should consult those guidelines on our website. And then lastly, our design and architectural standards. These went into effect back on January 1st, 2024. There's currently an FAQ out on those. I've heard that there's a forthcoming FAQ for the 2026 round, so please stay tuned for that. I'll also use this as an opportunity to plug the That's What I'm Talking About session here at the conference. So if you are interested in learning more about our design and architectural standards and where we're planning to hopefully take those in the future, there is a listening session here to hear what you guys have, hear comments that you have on those guidelines. So be sure to check out that session here at the conference. Now I want to highlight some of the elements or key elements within the 26, 27, 9% QAP itself that are threshold items across all projects submitted to us. First is looking at amenities. So new for this year, so rather than projects selecting from a small list of building amenities to receive points, projects now must include 2 building, 2 unit, and 2 lifestyle amenities as a threshold requirement. So applicants may request an amenity waiver to meet a threshold amenity requirement if the required amenity is located within a half mile of the project site. So if you have an urban site and there is a dog park within a half mile, you are able to submit an amenity waiver request to claim that dog park as part of it and not include that on your site. So these amenity waiver requests are required at proposal application. And we also state in the QAP that no more than 50% of these amenities may be waived. So we're requiring 6, so you can receive waivers for 3 of these if that applies to your situation. So again, this exception request is due at the proposal application stage. And then if the project is awarded, more detailed amenity information will be submitted with your final application. So kind of reducing a lot of this additional burden of work that you guys have had to do in the past on submitting documentation for all of these amenities at proposal. You just have to submit that amenity waiver, kind of let us know what you're planning to do at proposal. And then if you're funded, then you'll submit evidence of those amenities at final application. Next is really just looking at eligible basis boost. So the codified boost remains available for projects located in a QCT or difficult development area. This is providing a 130% basis boost when applicable. These areas are also included on our QAP interactive map on our website. So please be sure to look at that. There are some changes for the 26th round compared to 2025. There were some newly added QCTs, so be sure to look at those. Also want to highlight that our discretionary basis boost continues to be available through a deferral or recontribution of the project. So depending on that level of deferral or recontribution, projects are eligible to receive up to 130% basis boost based on evaluated financial need and feasibility of the project. For maximum LIHTC requests, so projects creating new affordability or serving tenant populations with special housing needs, you may request up to $1.8 million in annual LIHTCs. And preserved affordability has a max LIHTC request of 1.55 in annual LIHTC requests. So these levels are reflecting current development cost conditions and really help to ensure projects are sized appropriately for long-term sustainability. I also want to highlight cost containment, which has been updated for the 2026 round as noted in the QAP. So projects must be in compliance with these standards at proposal, final, and 8609. Projects that do not demonstrate compliance with the caps will be removed from consideration unless there is an underwriting exception request that's submitted at proposal and or final application. As stated in the QAP, these exception requests will only be considered for the following reasons, mostly if 1 or 2 of the cost containment standards fails to be met. So you can either be over on total development cost per unit or total development cost per gross square feet, and you can submit an exception request on stating why. This could be between larger unit sizes, less common space. It could be because of scattered site development. Could be the use of federal historic tax credits, Davis-Bacon wage rates, or other reasons that you might be able to demonstrate. However, if you are over on both of these cost caps, we will not consider an exception request. So that would be denied. And then lastly, on application limits, there are 3 tiers within our QAP based on experience with OFA in determining how many proposal applications an entity may submit and how many reservations that entity may receive. So for the most experienced developers, so this is demonstrated by having at least 3 8609s in Ohio in the past 10 years, you may submit up to 4 proposal applications and receive 2 reservations. For those that have at least 1 8609 in Ohio in the past 10 years, you may submit 3 proposal applications and receive 1 reservation. And then for those without Ohio 8609s but have LIHTC experience, you may submit 2 proposal applications and receive 1 reservation. So this did get changed from last year's QAP, so make sure to look at those requirements. So next, we're going to be talking about each of the individual funding pool threshold requirements. So again, all projects competing in these funding pools must meet specific funding pool definitions as well as any stated threshold requirements within that section. So as a reminder, new affordability general occupancy deals will comprise roughly 39% of our LIHTC ceiling. New affordability senior will comprise roughly 26% of our LIHTC ceiling. Preserved affordability will make up about 13% of our LIHTC ceiling, and then the updated and expanded tenant populations with special housing needs will comprise roughly 22% of our LIHTC ceiling. So outside of the earlier threshold requirements that were stated that all projects must adhere to, each funding pool has specific threshold requirements. So for the new affordability general occupancy projects, this includes a portion of units dedicated to extremely low income units. So units that are both rent and income restricted at 30% AMI. Please note that these are different than the 811 PRA requirements listed at the bottom of this list that I'll highlight here shortly. So to determine the percentage of ELI units required, you will need to use the OFA maps and look at the housing needs index. So if the project is located in a census tract with a housing needs index greater than 45, you will need to have 10% of units geared towards 30% AMI households. However, if the project is located in a census tract with a housing needs index less than or equal to 45, then you'll need to have 15% of the units geared towards 30% AMI households. The idea here is that the project will create a higher level of affordability or discount to market in areas with less housing need. Next, all projects must also include at least 15% of total units to 3 or more bedroom units. So in the last QAP, we only looked at 3-bedroom units. However, based on feedback, sometimes the market's actually requiring larger units. So we now allow this threshold item to include 4 and even 5-bedroom units for larger families in the market, or if you have even larger bedroom sizes, that can all be counted towards this 15% of 3 or more bedrooms at the project. And then lastly, all projects in this pool must also designate at least 15% of total LIHTC units or 11 units, whichever is lower to 811 PRA units. So all 811 PRA units must be 1-bedroom units. As indicated in the AFA, you also in the AFA, these must have a rent breakdown of the units must be underwritten at or below 50% AMI or fair market rent, whichever is lower. And then you'll show that these are targeted towards 30% AMI households. So the income is 30%, but the rental subsidy of the project is 50%. And then we also have written in the QAP that based on demand and federal requirements, OFA may reduce or fully release a reservation of 811 PRA encumbered through this threshold criteria. However, you still need to demonstrate compliance with this throughout the proposal and final application process. Next, for those competing in the new affordability senior funding pool, so similar to general occupancy, these projects must also include a percentage of units geared towards 30% AMI units, as shown on the slide. These projects must also include an experienced service coordinator and demonstrate at proposal and final application a commitment by an experienced local or regional service entity to coordinate appropriate services on site, or allow for the residents to connect to these services while on site. So they could be remote services that the experienced service coordinator is providing, but these services must be offered at least 15 minutes per unit per week for the duration of the compliance period. The service coordinator must also have a history of serving the target population, and in addition, the general partner, managing member, or the contracted third-party entity that will be providing these services must obtain at least one of the designations or certifications outlined in the QAP. So this could include core certification. This could be the organization is participating professional service coordination program through OSU. It could be through the Ohio Board of Nursing or a designation of the Area Agency on Aging by the Ohio Department of Aging. So applicants must evidence this requirement in the supported services plan due at proposal, final, and 8609. So looking at the threshold requirements for preserved affordability, to participate in this pool, projects must preserve an existing affordability, whether this is a prior LIHTC award or if it is preserving or maintaining project-based rental assistance, project-based operating subsidy on at least 50% of the total units. I also want to point out that new for this QAP, that projects located in a QCT and that include more than 70 units are ineligible to compete in this pool and are encouraged to use our 4% LIHTC programs. However, if the project can demonstrate infeasibility with the 4% LIHTC program, We do allow for an exception request to be submitted. We must receive this exception request by December 28th of this year in order for us to review and allow this project to submit in the upcoming round. Exception requests for this must be submitted to QAP@ohiohome.org. Next, all projects competing in this pool must meet a minimum rehab cost per unit of $80,000. This figure will be inflated for the 2027 round, but for 2026, the minimum is $80,000 per unit, and this must be maintained and supported by the PCNA and scope of work submitted with the project. Projects in this pool must also meet the definition of a moderate rehab B or substantial rehab as defined in our design and architectural standards. And for our fourth funding pool, the tenant populations with special housing needs. So this funding pool has been expanded and to include a variety of targeted populations that need both supportive services as well as rental subsidy. That's kind of the main point of this pool, is to target those populations that need both of these in a project. So at minimum, projects competing in this funding pool must target 25% of the total units to a population at or below 30% AMI. And these eligible populations include populations at or below 30% AMI with a disability. So this could be as defined in our permanent supportive housing PSH policy framework, as well as highlighted in the HUD coordinated entry service, entry notice, CPD 1701. So again, these are really focused towards COC referrals and looking at housing formerly homeless individuals. There's also other populations that are eligible, so these include transitioned age youth, so those 18 to 24 years of age who are exiting or formerly involved in the foster care, juvenile justice or behavioral health systems, but do not have a qualifying disability under the PSH policy framework. This is also looking at expectant mothers or parents experiencing housing instability, so particularly those engaged with public health or maternal health programs aimed at reducing infant mortality. This could also be parenting students that are 18 years of age or older, where the custodial parent of at least one child and are enrolled in a degree-seeking program. So this is looking kind of at our Scholar House model projects that we have funded in the past. And then lastly, looking at refugees that are identified by Refugee Resettlement Agency as referenced in the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services website, that are experiencing housing barriers. So those are kind of the eligible populations that can be served in this funding pool. Other requirements of this pool include that at least 100% of these units that are targeting one of those populations must have a firm commitment for project-based rental subsidy or rental assistance, excluding HUD 811 PRA. The project must also have the majority general partner or managing member be a nonprofit organization with experience developing, owning, or managing housing for the proposed target population. The services offered at the site must be available and appropriate to the needs of the target population, and the projects must also comply with the general public use requirement. Further requirements of this pool to submit an application. So all projects must have an expert recommendation. So projects competing in this pool must have a designation of a primary or secondary priority recommendation at the time of proposal application from the applicable COC for those targeting populations outlined in the PSH policy framework, or for populations that use a parallel public coordination system, such as individuals' development disabilities, from the applicable county board of development disabilities, or from a public entity such as local child welfare system of care, maternal health agencies, refugee resettlement agencies, post-secondary institutions, or local Adam H boards that have no affiliation with any member of the development team for those targeting populations outside the PSH framework. So applicants must submit that applicable letter of designation or recommendation in the competitive support documents at proposal. These projects must also have local partner or tenant referral systems. So the parent entity of the nonprofit majority general partner of the project competing in this pool must have an established MOU with a referral agency. So this could be with a continuum of care. This could be with the County Board of Developmental Disabilities. It could be the local child welfare system of care, maternal health agency, refugee resettlement agency, post-secondary institution, any of such. But they must have some type of establishment to let us know, basically submit an MOU with one of these referral agencies, kind of outlining how tenants are going to be referred to the project. And then lastly for this, so similar to the senior projects, these projects also have to have an experienced service coordinator. So projects will submit that the supportive services plan with the proposal application and final application, as well as at 8609 for the experienced service coordinator for the project. All right, so now that we've kind of covered the foundation, so really looking at what's all required for each of these threshold requirements that each project must meet to actually even compete. We're now going to talk about the competitive side of the 9% round, so specifically where projects are actually earning points. So thus, every project that kind of reaches scoring is already eligible, as all projects are meeting our minimum threshold requirements to apply for the 9% credits. So the scoring framework for the 2026-2027 9% LIHTC QAP is built around 3 primary categories. Together, these are kind of reflecting this core policy goal for the round. So to prioritize projects, provide access to opportunity that are responding to demonstrated need and use tax credits efficiently. So in partnership with the Urban Institute, they created 3 indices for OFA to use for this QAP. These include the Neighborhood Opportunity Index, which includes both the General Occupancy Opportunity Index as well as the Senior Opportunity Index. They also created the Housing Need Index as well as the Neighborhood Change Index. To learn more about their methodology, we do have this posted on the 9% page, so look for the Ohio Opportunity Indices methodology to dive deeper into how these indices were created. So the first category is the Neighborhood Opportunity Index. This accounts for a project's 40% of the project's score. This measures the level of access the site provides to things such as jobs, schools, transportation, healthcare, grocery, and other community services. So the policy goal behind this is to really support housing in higher opportunity locations for both general occupancy and seniors. Thus, depending on the population you are serving, it would determine which opportunity index you will use. So particularly in the preserved affordability pool, if you are submitting a preserved senior deal, you would use a senior opportunity index, but if your preserved deal is a general occupancy project, you'll use the general occupancy index. If you're also competing in the tenant populations of special housing need, you'll use the general occupancy opportunity index. The second category is the Housing Needs Index, weighted at 35% of the applicant score. So this is about matching project to local demand. So this is really looking at rent burden, shortage of units, and other indicators that reflect where additional affordable housing is needed most. So I will note that the AFA will automatically calculate both of these indices based on the project's location, so the majority of LIHTC units within a 2020 census tract. So if you have a project that crosses multiple census tracts, you must enter that census tract that includes the majority of units for scoring purposes. And this will be verified during the review process. And then lastly, the third category is credits per unit, which makes up 25% of the scoring. So this encourages projects that are appropriately sized and efficiently structured, meaning the amount of credits requested is aligning with the number of units being produced. So this is kind of scaled to that 65 units. So if you remember back to the earlier slides where we tracked the average project size, we're trying to get it back into the mid 60s, which is where this is scaled to. So this scoring model is really trying to be balanced. It's kind of looking at where the project's located, how well it responds to housing need, and how efficiently it uses credits. So the example shown on the slide illustrates how those elements are kind of combined. So if a project is located in a census tract with a neighborhood opportunity score of an 80, it has a housing needs score of 50, and is structured to receive full points on the credit per unit. The resulting score would be 74.5 out of 100. And so the key takeaway is really that strong scoring is kind of shaped early. It really depends on site selection, kind of looking at market alignment and deal sizing decisions. That's kind of looking at where you are creating this project. I also want to note that each individual criterion will be auto-calculated in the AFA in sum, so only the calculated total score will be rounded to the nearest hundredth or 2 decimal places. So let's look at how this plays out with the 2 geography-based scoring components of the Neighborhood Opportunity and Housing Needs Index. So if you haven't already, I highly suggest that you go to our website and download the 2026-2027 QAP MAP final data. The blue columns shown on this slide are provided in that Excel workbook. And then it's really looking at a math equation. So to determine how a general occupancy project will score, you'll take the raw general housing index score, multiply it by 0.4, and then you'll add that to the housing needs index that's multiplied by 0.35. So these 2 numbers will create your general occupancy score shown in the green column. So I created the green column, so I'm hoping you guys can do the math at home as well to see how each of these census tracts are scoring. You would then be able to calculate these scores for all census tracts in Ohio. You're also able to then sort this table with the columns by region. So if you're focusing on a current region, you can kind of see how different census tracts are scoring. You can also filter this further into the metro and rural counties to kind of decipher how our award sequence is kind of pointing out where deals will be funded. The key takeaway here, it is impossible to score 100% of the points. This was by design. So for example, the highest scoring census tract for general occupancy in Ohio only scores 82% of the 75 points. The highest scoring census tract for senior scores 90% of the 75 points. So even once you add in, say, that project is getting the full points of the 25 for the annual LIHTC request per unit, you're still not capping out at 100% of the points. So there will not be a project awarded that scores 100% of the points. So keep that in mind when you're putting together your application. If you're trying to think, oh, it doesn't score 100%, well, no project will score 100%. So this is done much differently than other rounds at OFA and in prior QAP rounds. That typically you needed a perfect score to be awarded, but this is all based on the region. This is all based on the metro rural split out. So just keep that in mind. Also, as you start to filter the data, you'll also notice that each region varies by highest score, and each metro rural county by region also max out at different scores. And it's because of this and knowing that each region has unique levels of opportunity as well as housing need on why we're really moving to this regional competition. Because we recognize that opportunity and housing needs of Northwest Ohio different from Southeast Ohio, and those differ from the 3C regions. So this methodology really allows for 3 different types of neighborhoods to be funded. So we're kind of probably see high scoring census tracts that include those with high opportunity but may have a low housing need. It could be neighborhoods with low opportunity but high housing need, or it could be a neighborhood with a moderate opportunity and moderate housing need. So each region and metro rural split creates different targeted neighborhoods on which are the highest scoring. So I'll also point out here that due to one of the major policy goals of this QAP of creating this geographic distribution of awards, census tracts are limited to just one 9% award per program year. This is across all funding pools. So if a census tract that includes the highest scoring general occupancy and senior projects, only one of these will be awarded. So keep that in mind, that it's just like it's one award across all 4 funding pools per census tract. So try not to target the same census tract, as only one will be potentially awarded. All right, so now that we've covered the baseline eligibility, how projects are scored, we're now going to step through and walk through this award sequence and how we are going to be allocating our credit ceiling. So before diving into the specifics of the award sequence outlined in the QAP, I just want to provide this summary table up front. It's also included at the end of all the sequencing to kind of provide a summary of everything, but hoping that this will provide a nice guideline for you guys all to follow along with the process. So based on our 26 credit ceiling, we anticipate awarding 23 projects. I want to preface that this number is based on each project receiving the max LIHTC request. Thus, if projects are funded do not request this full LIHTC amount, more projects should be awarded. This is also based on Ohio's population slightly increasing, so we won't know that final IRS population estimate number until late spring of next year. So we won't officially know what our LIHTC credit ceiling is until about March or sometimes April, maybe even May of next year, depending on circumstances. So this table is showing how the 9% credit ceiling is allocated across different set-asides, different regional awards for the 2026 round. So the first two, so we'll start making awards to set-aside categories first, and then we'll move into the regional new affordability awards. The first group of awards will be those two CHOTO projects. So these are across all funding pools, and we'll be awarding two CHOTO projects. Projects 3 through 6 are the tenant populations with special housing needs set aside. So this will include two COC referrals, so continuum of care. So again, focusing on those that are experiencing homelessness. Those will be the next two projects funded. We'll also fund one non-COC referral project and then one balance of state housing project. So together, the tenant populations with special housing need projects will account for about 22% of the statewide 9% credit ceiling. So it's like if you're doing the math, it's just like we have 4 projects listed. We should be able to fund 5 projects in this funding pool, but it all depends on, again, on the requests. We're just being conservative with these numbers here. After those projects are funded, we'll then move to our preserved affordability pool. We'll first fund a rental assistance project. So these are projects that help support developments where operating subsidy is a key component, or rental subsidy. We'll fund the high scoring project there, and then we'll fund our LIHTC resyndication project. These categories collectively represent about 13% of the credit ceiling. So again, I'm estimating about 3 projects. It could be 4, it could be 5. Again, it just depends on the LIHTC requests that they are projects that are being funded, being accounted for 13% of our LIHTC ceiling. So once those set-asides are complete, we then move into the new affordability regional awards. So this is accounting for a majority of the annual credit ceiling. So again, roughly 65% of our credit ceiling will be towards new affordability projects, both general occupancy and senior. These awards will be made by region, going from the least populous region to the most. So we'll first be funding in Southeast, then we'll move to Northwest, then Central, Southwest, and then Northeast. Within each region, there's also this balance between metro and rural counties, where the first deal funded in each region will be the top scoring rural project. This ensures credits are distributed geographically while still reflecting competitiveness and deal readiness. And then finally, Project 23 will represent the Strategic Initiative Award. This is providing flexibility to respond to emerging needs or opportunities that align with the statewide housing goals. So the overall flow is the CHOTO projects, then the tenant populations with special housing needs, preserved affordability, and then the new affordability, and then strategic initiative. I'll also point out that at the bottom that we have 2 of these projects will also be funded that are in a QCT with a concerted community revitalization plan. If you've already looked at the scoring, you'll notice that many QCTs are kind of the highest scoring census tracts in the state. So I assume that those will actually be awarded competitively rather than through a designated set aside at the end. But we do have language in the QAP that allows us to fund these at the end of the cycle. So getting more into the details of each of these, so kind of expanding upon what I just said. So again, before we get into the regional distribution of credits, we'll start with the set-asides that are awarded at the front end of the sequence. So we begin with the CHOTO sponsor set-aside. So we're awarding the 2 highest scoring eligible projects with the safeguard of 1 region and 1 per funding pool. So the funding pools is looking at new affordability general occupancy, new affordability senior, preserved affordability, and tenant populations with special housing needs. So a CHODO from at least 2 of those funding pools. This is ensuring that CHODO-led projects are consistently represented across the state. I'll also point out that even though projects can typically request $1 million in home funds, in the event that home funds may not be available, we encourage projects to submit a backup financial commitment to cover this $1 million request that you're seeking in home funds. If you do not, and we do not have home funds to give out, this project will be shown as having a $1 million financing gap and will be removed from consideration. So it's very crucial that if you are seeking home funds as a CHODO, to also submit a financial commitment for those home funds as a backup. Next, we'll move into the tenant populations with special housing needs set-asides. So within this, there are 3 set-asides. So the first is looking at that continuum of care or COC referral partnership, where the 2 highest scoring projects are selected, again with 1 project per region. Then we'll do the highest scoring non-COC referral partnership, and then the balance of state category, which also awards the highest scoring eligible project. So again, given that this funding pool is to receive approximately 22% of our credit ceiling, if there are leftover credits, we'll then try to fund the next highest scoring project that can be fully funded within this funding pool allocation. If we are unable to fully fund a project, then these credits will then be reallocated to this regional distribution for new affordability projects. After those are awarded, we then move to preserved affordability and focus on these 2 subpools, awarding the highest scoring project per region. So this will look, first, we'll fund the highest scoring rental assistance project, and then we'll score the highest scoring LIHTC re-syndication project, and then we'll continue to fund projects flipping between the 2 subpools until no further project can be fully funded. Again, if credits remain, these will be reallocated to the regional distribution for new affordability projects. So in summary on these, CHODO projects, tenant populations with special housing need, and then preserved affordability projects are funded first. Once these are made, we then move to the regional new affordability pools where the majority of remaining credits are awarded. So after those set-asides are awarded, the remaining credits for new affordability, so looking at new affordability general occupancy, new affordability senior, are distributed by region based on population. So this is to help ensure that every part of the state has access to 9% credits, not just the areas that tend to submit the most applications. So the map on the left shows the 5 regions: the Southeast, Northwest, Central, Southwest, and Northeast. And the table on the right shows the share of Ohio's population each region represents based on the most recent 5-year ACS data. That percentage is used to calculate how much of the credit ceiling is available for new affordability awards in each region. Further, this percentage also dictates where we start with funding decisions. We state that we'll start in the least populated region first, up to the most populated region. So we'll start in the Southeast, which represents 7% of the state's population. And so they will receive approximately 7% of that regional distribution of credits. And then we'll go to Northwest with 13%, Central, Southwest, and then Northeast. Now, within each region, the allocation for new affordability projects is further divided into metro and rural sub-allocations. So this comes directly from the QAP policy language. This split is based on the share of the region's population that lives in metro counties versus rural counties. So regions where large metro areas will have more of their credits available to metro projects, and regions with rural population will have more credits available to rural projects. In the Southeast region, the calculation is kind of straightforward. The entire region is made up of rural counties, so the region's allocation is 100% rural. When looking at the Northwest region, just like we discussed, each region's allocation is split between metro and rural. In Northwest, we have both metro and rural counties, so about 41% of the region's population is located in metro counties, primarily Lucas and Wood, while about 59% of the region's population lives in rural counties. So when we allocate credits for this region, the available credit ceiling is divided among those proportions with roughly 40-60 metro to rural split. However, it's important to note that the QAP includes this safeguard that at least one rural project in every region will be funded, even if the raw split would otherwise favor metro projects. So this is ensuring that rural communities have a meaningful and guaranteed path to awards. So in the Northwest Ohio, metro and rural projects are not competing directly with each other. They each have their own sub-allocation, and the rural counties are guaranteed representation in the award sequence as long as there's at least one competitive project. So anticipating doing one rural deal in Northwest, and then there was potentially one metro deal in Northwest as well. In Central region, the population distribution is very different from Southeast and Northwest. Central is overwhelmingly metro. About 93% of the population is located in metro counties, primarily Franklin and the surrounding counties, and only about 7% of the population in this region is rural. So when we split the region's allocation, almost all the available credit ceiling is split on the metro side, which are much smaller on the rural side. However, the same safeguard applies here as in every region. The highest scoring rural project in every region will be funded, provided it meets our threshold requirements. So even in the regions where rural populations are small, there is still a clear and guaranteed pathway for rural development. There's also an additional policy detail unique to Central region. So Franklin County is limited to 4 9% awards in a single year, while every other county in the region is limited to 1. When looking at Southwest, so it's similar to Central, predominantly metropolitan. So again, we're ensuring that at least one rural deal will be funded in Southwest Ohio, and then the remaining awards will most likely be in the metro counties. And Hamilton County is capped at 2 9% awards in a single round, and all other counties are limited to 1. And then finally, we look at Northeast. So this has the largest population share of any region, so about 36% of the state. Again, we see a majority metro region with only 17% living in a rural county. However, again, we have the same guardrail in here that the highest scoring rural project in the region will be funded first. So we'll fund the first highest scoring rural deal in Northeast, and then we'll go into funding the metro deals. Cuyahoga County has a limitation of 3 9% awards, and all other counties in the Northeast are limited to 1 award. So now that we've looked at how credits are distributed across regions and split between metro and rural counties, the next step is understanding how awards are made within each region. So for new affordability, each region follows a consistent 2-step sequence. So step 1 is to fund the highest scoring rural project. So this is either a general occupancy or a rural project. Again, this is to ensure that every region has at least 1 rural award. And then step 2 is then to fund the highest scoring project from the opposite funding pool. So if step 1 funds a general occupancy in rural, step 2 will fund the highest scoring senior project in that region. Whereas if step 1 funds a senior project, then in rural, then step 2 will fund the highest scoring metro deal. After the 2 awards, the region continues alternating back and forth between the 2 funding pools. So at the table, or at the bottom, are just these tables kind of outlining the sequencing that's really highlighting the 40-60 split in our QAP. So once the regional awards are complete, if a region does not have enough remaining credits to fully fund the next eligible project, those unused credits will roll up to a statewide pool. This is called a statewide redistribution of unused regional credits. OFA will use this statewide pool to meet 2 priorities. So first, ensuring that 2 projects that are located in a QCT that are part of a concerted community revitalization plan are funded. So if 2 projects were not funded in the earlier award sequence, then they will be prioritized here. And then we'll also reserve resources for at least 1 project on the Community Impact Strategic Initiative. So again, this is for new construction developments that are either general occupancy or senior. So again, just highlighting this sequencing, so kind of just spelling this out again. Hopefully this is providing you guys with a cheat sheet of the award sequence outlined in the QAP. So now just kind of going into the technical assistance, kind of looking at key deadlines, submission stuff on what's coming up. So looking at the 2026 program calendar, we're currently here at the technical assistance session. Here at the conference. The next major milestone is coming quickly. So this is the experience and capacity documentation and submission windows for CHOTO certification. So this is between December 2nd through January 8th. So if your organization needs CHOTO status, start this process early. The guidelines and application are on our website. January 9th is the deadline to submit FAQs, so make sure to get those in so we can post those to our website. After that, we are accepting proposal applications that are due February 26th. Awards will be announced at our May board meeting, and then those that are receiving a 9% award will have a final application date deadline of September 17th. So as I mentioned earlier, when you are submitting our application, all submissions must be uploaded to our multifamily development file transfer site, or FTS. If you don't already have access, you can request it by emailing multifamilyftp@ohiohome.org. When you submit, everything must be uploaded in a single zip file, and make sure that those files are numbered or identified as what's listed in Appendix A. This makes our job a lot easier to review these applications and make sure that things aren't missed. You're also still required to submit a hard copy 11 by 17 architectural plans with proposal and final application. Again, make sure to pay attention to Appendix A, just seeing on when things are kind of due at different stages, since there were some switches from last year's QAP, so try not to just think about what you did last year, but really review the QAP Appendix A. Also just highlighting experience and capacity, so be sure to look at our website to see if you are already approved for the 26th round. We have over 70, I think, organizations that are already approved for the 2026 round, so this could be you, which means that you don't have to resubmit experience and capacity standards or submit for that application next month. So be sure to look at that list on our website. And then just kind of key policy administrative items. Again, we talked a lot about last year with our ex parte discussion policy. This is still in play. So after we receive a competitive application, you're unable to really contact OFA staff and to talk about the application unless it's during an explicit period. So make sure to review that policy. We also have our good standing policy that makes sure that all those participating in our rounds are have no unresolved compliance issues, they're meeting deadlines, honoring commitments. And so make sure to check out the good standing policy in Appendix B to learn about that. We also have our post awards requirements. So we'll send out the sequel, our carryover allocation, 10% test, 8609. So those are outlined in our QAP. I also just wanted to highlight new for this QAP, we did add in a credit refresh exchange policy. So this is new. So for products that are unable to meet the 10% test deadline, you are able to submit for this credit exchange. It comes with a 1% reservation fee penalty to exchange or refresh your credits. So in the past, we only had the place and service release or the special allocation, but we added in this credit refresh exchange policy based on need from the development community. Well, I am around here at the conference, so if you have questions, feel free to stop me. And thank you so much for attending today. And this recording will be posted to our website. So thank you.